Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank here in Philadelphia. Thank you for coming this afternoon. We have a very interesting presentation from Jacques deLisle, who is the director of FPRI's Asia program, and Guobin Yang, who is the Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communication and Sociology at the Annenberg School for Communication and Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. They're here to talk about their latest book, The Party Leads All, The Evolving Role of the Chinese Communist Party. I think it will be a very interesting discussion, particularly in light of the recent party congress. We will be taking your questions roughly halfway through the program, so please put them in the Q&A box. Also, I want to take a moment to remind you that FPRI is going to be having its gala in Philadelphia. We'll also have a hybrid option for you to, I think, watch the video perhaps afterwards, possibly in person. I'm not sure about that, but put December 6th on your calendar. We will be talking about FPRI and good works of good Americans overseas, including FPRI. So again, December 6th on your calendar. So without further ado, let me turn the reins over to Jacques deLisle, who, as I mentioned, is the director of FPRI's Asia program and our China Center. He's also the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Jacques, I'll turn the reins over to you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Raleigh, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a special pleasure to welcome to this edition of our Asia program series of webinars my colleague Guobin Yang, who Raleigh introduced briefly. He's also the deputy director of our center, and the book we're going to be talking about today is a volume we co-edited based on our center's annual conference. This actually started as a book focused on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, which occurred in 2021. And production delays and authors being what they are, it went a bit beyond that, but it came out really on the eve of the 20th Party Congress, which was just concluded, and which I think gave as one of its main takeaways essentially the title of our book, The Party Leads All, a reaffirmation of the party's leading role and Xi Jinping's leading role within the party. So we welcome questions about the book and the themes in the book, but also about the recent events at the Party Congress and what it all means. So we're kind of doubling in this session. So the way we're going to lead off is I'm going to say a little bit about the book in general, and then Guobin and I will take turns talking about some of the chapters. Some of them we'll just touch upon, some we'll go into in a bit more depth, but it's really just to give you a sense of what we see as common themes in the party's roles in China today. And to hopefully prime the pump for a discussion. One thing I'll say before I go into the quick description of part of the book is that the book as a whole does look at how the party's roles have evolved from when it first took power in 1949 to the present. It emphasizes primarily the contemporary era, that is the Xi Jinping years in power, and I think our descriptions are going to lean more toward the contemporary period, partly in the assumption that that's what everybody wants to talk about. So the Chinese Communist Party is a remarkable party. It is the second largest political party in the world by membership. Only the BJP, the ruling party in India, is larger, but it has somewhat less demanding membership criteria. And if you want to measure success of a political party, well, staying in power is one way of doing it, and the Chinese Communist Party has been in power for a long time. It has outlived all of its Leninist brethren except for the North Korean Workers' Party, which came to power slightly earlier, and which has now become pretty much a client state of China. The people at the apex of power in China and at positions of power all the way down the hierarchy in the state and government and many extra governmental organizations and the military as well, they are all party people, and they are all there at least significantly because of their party roles. And the title comes from an old Mao era saying that has been revived in recent years, which is that the party leads all. It's actually a much longer phrase I won't burden you with at the moment. But if we think about the Chinese Communist Party's characteristics, which do a lot to define its role, I think there are a few that one can point to. It is an authoritarian political party. To the extent that there's an idea of democracy here, and we hear the term a lot, it is democracy framed in terms of serving the interests of the people or the collectivity, rather than preferences, especially as expressed through electoral or other proceedings. How authoritarian the party has been has waxed and waned over the years. It bordered on the totalitarian in some of the Mao years. It got very soft and relatively soft as an authoritarian regime during the reform years, and the Xi era has been somewhere in between, with, I think, what most of our authors and contributors would describe as a drift back toward a more authoritarian take. It's also a nationalist party. The Chinese Communist Party is heir to the Chinese Nationalist Revolution. It completed that, in a sense, in 1949, even though the revolution had roots really late in the preceding century or the early part of the 20th century. And we see nationalism taking a very large role during the Xi Jinping era, where we see phrases like the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the China dream as being major ideological pronouncements. And again, it goes all the way back. Thirdly, the Chinese Communist Party has been a party that leads an economically developmentalist state. Growth has been a target pretty much throughout the entire PRC era, including under Mao, but it was very much a target during the reform years, sort of 1979 until at least the beginning of the Xi era or thereabouts. And it is still a priority, despite some willingness to endure some hits to growth, particularly during the COVID years. But the way the party has pursued economic development has changed considerably over the years, being more or less market-free, ranging really from very pro-market to much more planned. And I think we've seen the pendulum swing back under Xi toward a large state role in guiding the economy. But fourth and perhaps foremost, it is a Leninist party, indeed a Leninist party with Chinese characteristics. And what that means is it emphasizes organizational structure. It's hierarchical, it's top-down, the leadership matters a great deal. And one key theme of the Xi Jinping era has been to strengthen the party as an organization. And this is something we saw at the 20th Party Congress, an indictment about how lax party discipline had gotten, how flabby and corrupt the party had become during the years preceding Xi. So we've seen a lot of effort in recent years to do institution building, so-called self-supervision, anti-corruption, intra-party discipline, and things like that, strengthening the party's internal disciplinary mechanisms and merging them into a state supervision commission that targets corruption. And we've seen the party tighten its grip over many organizations outside the party state in the economy, society, and so on. But organizational strength is only part of the story for a Leninist party. The other side is ideology. A motivating ideology that gives the organization its purpose, its raison d'etre, its sort of animating force. Ideology is, again, back in a more prominent position. And the most perilous moment for the party, arguably, has been moments of ideological turmoil, including the democracy movement in 1989. Under Xi, we've seen a lot more discussion of ideology. We've seen the terms like the Chinese dream, the great rejuvenation, the four comprehensives, and perhaps most centrally, if somewhat verbosely, Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. As I'm sure we'll talk about, a lot of those ideological tropes are kind of anodyne, but they are once again front and center. And at the very least, under Xi, the party has tightened its grip on the space for political discourse. There's much less room for dissent, for heterodox views, for those who would push an alternative ideological vision. Now, as I said, the chapters in this book cover various aspects of the party's roles in Chinese society, with attention that goes all the way back to the founding of the regime, but that focuses mostly on the Xi years. So I'm going to go through, and Guobin will pitch in on some of these, on the chapters, the sort of focus of the various chapters. So at the front end, we have some more political chapters. Bruce Dixon argues that we've seen in the Chinese Communist Party a Leninist revival under Xi, an emphasis on the eliteness of the party, an emphasis on party building throughout society, and a turn to digital technology to strengthen control over society. Li Chang, who comments on Chinese elite politics, argues that during the reform era, Chinese, that is from 79 on, Chinese Communist Party elite politics was long characterized by an intra-party balance, a degree of rotation in power between groups that are associated with Jiang Zemin and after him Xi Jinping, the so-called princelings, people associated with a high growth, openness, and sort of coastal experience, that is places like Shanghai, Fujian, all along the Chinese coast. Those people being one faction, and the other being Hu Jintao, Li Keqiang, the current premier Hu Jintao, the recently humiliated ex-leader, who are associated with the Communist Youth League, with service in more inland and poorer areas, and there was this kind of balance. And Li argues, and I think many analysts would agree, that that balance is gone. Xi Jinping has marginalized, as the 20th Party Congress confirmed, really marginalized that other faction, the so-called Communist Youth League faction, and has even decapitated a lot of his own side, the princeling faction, the other sort of members of the long-standing elite, and has really consolidated power in his own hands and has adopted a quasi-populist set of policies that used to be associated more with the group, the first faction that he marginalized. We have a chapter by Cheng Chen on ideology, which essentially says ideology is back, but argues that it's a pretty weak and empty ideology in many ways, so it's not really clear how well it's going to work. That it may produce popular discontent or disillusionment, and that Xi may even face a fundamentalist backlash from true leftists. Melanie Mannion has a chapter on corruption and says that corruption has become a big problem for the there all the way along, but in the Xi years, it's been seen as a problem of factionalism and a problem of a deep organizational flaw that needs to be addressed. We have a chapter on law by He Xin, who talks about the ways in which many of the reforms of the Xi era and before have actually improved the quality of law. It has reduced illegitimate influences through bribery, corrupt connections, things like that. But under Xi, it has strengthened the party's so-called legitimate, what in the party's view is legitimate interference. The party state intervening in politically charged cases and to make sure judges and others are properly vetted for political rectitude. Margaret Pearson has a chapter on state-owned enterprises and argues that the Xi era has seen a reassertion of state control over state-owned enterprises because of a concern these enterprises had grown very large, often corrupt, and were really often economically inefficient, and were unresponsive to the party's agenda. So despite a rhetorical commitment to reform, further market reforms, which has sometimes happened, we've also seen a reinvigoration of mechanisms of control. The party exercises more control over vetting senior officials at companies, has given more power to the party committees relative to corporate boards, has enhanced the party building and party leadership requirements within company charters and in corporate social responsibility rules. And we've seen a financialization of state control. The state now has the levers of being an investor, both in state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, and uses that leverage to actually exercise greater economic control because it doesn't pay for everything. It can just use them to get what it wants. On the other hand, Mannion argues there are huge principal agent problems. There's a vast multi-layered system, and it's very hard to make the center's will run all the way into enterprises. And the state-owned enterprises now exist in markets and face serious competitive pressures. So have to behave more or less the way capitalist enterprises might to a significant degree. deLisle has a chapter on private enterprises and hits many of the same themes that Mannion does about the expanding party role, targeting private enterprises, committees within those enterprises, regulatory restrictions, the so-called regulatory storm that has the wings of the high-flying tech entrepreneurs who were seen as insufficiently responsive to the party's goals and is seen as not doing their share in terms of contributing to so-called common prosperity, a kind of vaguely welfarist redistributionist agenda, and is frankly a source of worry about private concentrations of power, some of which might be put to politically troubling ends from the view of the party and state. On the other hand, He says that basically these enterprises face only limited pressure, less than is often perceived in outside commentaries, because these private enterprises perform vital functions for the state. They provide employment, they provide growth, they provide particularly advancement in the technological sectors, which are the top priority for the regime, and they even have been key contributors to the development of the high-tech surveillance state. So that's the story in politics and the economy. Let me turn it over to my colleague Guobin to talk about some of the chapters that focus more on the party's role in society.
Thank you very much, Jacques, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll start with a few words about ideology, which Jacques just also talked about, because I think ideology and the changes in the past decade in terms of the ideological term provide, I think, important context for us to understand the changes in civil society, in media, and all areas of Chinese life. And so in a way, a few chapters I'm going to talk about very briefly, really, on media, civil society, religion, rural society, and ideology, in all their own ways, support the thesis of the book, which is the title of the book, that party leads all in all areas of life. But Professor Cheng Chen, the author of the chapter on ideology, starts with analysis of the ideology in the Mao period, when, of course, ideology was dominant. But then ideology was on the retreat when it came to the Deng Xiaoping period, all the way to Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, the previous the administration before the current President Xi Jinping, when they took a more or less pragmatic approach and de-emphasized ideology. So when Xi Jinping came into office in 2012, there's really, as Jacques said, renewed emphasis on ideology. But in some ways, it's not a complete discontinuity, because at the end of Hu Jintao's administration, Hu Jintao was already emphasizing in his reports to the party, I think, on the crisis of governance. There was a report on the crisis of governance. So among the top leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, in other words, there was an understanding that the Communist Party seems to be loosening control on various fronts to the extent there was a crisis. So introducing and reintroducing ideology was Xi Jinping's approach to managing this crisis in governance, and to rebuild party cohesion and party strength. So that's an important background for understanding, I think, all the developments in the past 10 years. So the chapter on rural governance by Professor Deng Yanhua. Professor Deng is a sociology professor in Nanjing University in China. She's an expert on rural issues, rural governance, but also has published a lot on contentious politics in China. So she analyzes, again, the recent decades developments in village governance, starting with 1998. China began to introduce village elections, which brought a lot of hope, both to domestic liberals and the international community. With the introduction of the village elections, there was really an introduction of a dual power system at the very village level, but in other words, at the very grassroots level of Chinese society. Before that, it was the party secretary of the village who was the sole leader of the village level administration. But the elections, what were they about? They were elections of a new village committee, which was headed by a director. And so the village committee basically shared power with the party secretary. So there is a kind of dual power structure introduced through this system. And we know that over the period of 10 years, the village elections, there were hopes, but there were also challenges, there were problems. So there is a lot of work, a lot of research on that. Professor Deng then emphasized that beginning in 2018, officially, although the process had started before 2018, but officially from 2018, the Chinese system began to try to reform, change that system. Instead of a dual structural system, the old system, basically restoring the old system of the party secretary being the sole leader at the grassroots level. So it's called one person in two positions. The village committees are still there, but the head of the village committee was no longer at the same level as the party secretary, but becomes the second leader, second ranking leader at the village level. So that essentially brought the dual structure, power structure at the village level to the end, beginning from 2018. So that is Professor Deng's analysis. Of course, there are challenges in introducing this system. There was sort of some variations by region, by provinces, but overall, it was done very quickly. Just shows the kind of determination at very top level of again having the party leading, being the top leader at the very grassroots level. The chapter on religion by Professor Carrie Cosell also again traces the history of religious policies since 1949, the beginning of the PRC. But again, the emphasis is on the recent Xi Jinping period. And here, I'll just, given the time, I'll just very briefly mention that her argument is that under the Xi Jinping administration, there is this new trend of sinicization of religion, emphasizing that religious practices, religious administrations have to be patriotic. Of course, this was the theme in earlier periods as well, but now there's a new emphasis. There are more regulations, new regulations in this area about the administration of religion in China. There was emphasis on reducing the influence of foreign actors. And of course, linking this is one of the new themes, linking religion to national security. So overall trend is what Professor Cosell calls sinicization of religion, and really having all major religious organizations pledging loyalty to the party, and also Chinese traditional values, and core socialist values. Two more chapters to cover very quickly. Diana Fu and Emil Dirks, their chapter is Party Struggle to Tame Civil Society. Their emphasis, again, is there are two main points about the period before Xi Jinping's administration under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. They characterize as fragmented control of civil society, when civil society organizations, citizens enjoyed quite a bit of space for their activities, even though there was still control, was fragmented control. Under the Xi Jinping administration, they characterized the changes, which I will again very quickly outline. But their general characterization is centralized repression. And this centralized repression is evident in three aspects. First, new regulations were introduced to govern civil society, for instance, charity law, overseas NGO law, and this is one area. Second is the more repression of grassroots organizations and activities. And they cited especially examples of a crackdown on the student groups, campus, university students, the Marxist groups, they came under repression. The third aspect is the deepening of CCP, of the party control into civil society, again, in many areas of civil society, but especially introducing party branches into NGOs and nonprofit organizations. This is a kind of a principle. How this has been implemented, it varies a lot. I think that there are some organizations where party branches are established, but not uniformly done so. Finally, they also cover the online sphere, cyber sphere, and their argument is that, again, in this sphere is also tightening of online expression, but the tightening of control does not or has not brought to an end citizen civic engagement online. The final chapter I'll cover is Professor Maria Repnikova's chapter on China, on the party and the media in broadly. And her argument is really summarized very well in one paragraph, which I will actually read because I have the book right in front of me. And here is her characterization, her argument. The recent crisis in Wuhan, so she wrote the chapter when Wuhan was locked down in 2020, once again demonstrates that Chinese media politics is a more complicated story than that of complete party dominance over the media. It is a story of ongoing guarded improvisation, or mutual dynamic adaptation. But now with Xi Jinping era characteristics, including more intensified control and propaganda operations. So she is sort of, I think, somewhat more positive or optimistic. I guess I wouldn't say optimistic, but the image is not as dark as the chapter on civil society, because she sees there's still there's a possibility for adaptation, for maneuvering on the media, media professionals, journalists, and so on. But then she also described some of the changes, intensification of control. One major trend is the commercial co-optation of major internet players such as Tencent, Alibaba. We might recall that in recent years there was a crackdown on these big tech companies. And they also emphasized some new approaches to media propaganda control. An approach that emphasizes what she calls participatory persuasion 2.0, which is to emphasize the use of the social media and the mobilization of the masses. Is almost a kind of mass lying strategy of the Mao era, to mobilize the public and the masses in support of party agendas as a form of persuasion. So I think, Jacques, I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm just going to say a few words about the couple of remaining chapters that turn to security and external affairs. Andrew Scoble has a chapter on the party's relationship to the military, and he argues that contrary to some alarmist views, the party has never really faced serious problems of loyalty and control in the military. That there basically has not been a major problem with the party controlling the gun. And he argues that the success is stemmed not primarily from the mechanisms of organizational control, such as the Central Military Commission, which is headed by the top leader. The three top posts tend to be party general secretary, the chairmanship of the state, often called the presidency, and the chairmanship of the Central Military Commission. Those are all in the same person's hands. But Scoble argues that that's not really what's doing the work here, nor is ideological indoctrination of the military, but rather it's the degree to which the party and the military are fused. Certainly true in the revolutionary period, and he argues that it continues to this day, and that we can think of the Chinese People's Liberation Army as, in effect, the party in uniform. And the final chapter, Bates-Gill, looks at the party's role in China's external relations. And basically, for much of the reform era, the foreign policy of the People's Republic of China was to a significant degree in the hands of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of National Defense, certainly directed by the party leadership, but there was a role for these institutions in strategic decision-making. But the claim in Gill's analysis, during the Xi years, the party role has grown. The ministries have been reduced to mere implementing agencies for party-determined policy, and that there are two motivations for this. One is to promote the party's legitimacy, both at home and abroad, and this meant convincing domestic audiences as well as foreign audiences, but especially domestic audiences, that the party defends China's interests and has led China's rise as a rich and powerful country, and that the party has pushed narratives of aggrieved Chinese nationalism, the correctness of the party's ideological line, and the success of the party's governance model in providing domestic prosperity and international peace, as well as increasingly over the years the party's role as the stewards of Chinese cultural heritage, something that would have been unimaginable in the Mao years, but has been prominent under Xi. The second imperative of the party taking a larger role in foreign policy, according to Gil, is the perception of China's deteriorating external security situation, and to a degree its internal situation of security as well. So Tibet, Xinjiang, the territorial disputes along China's periphery, and the sharpening great power and ideational rivalry with the United States. And the response to this had been to reduce the organizational fragmentation of the party's foreign affairs apparatus and to centralize party control over foreign affairs work. This has meant putting a lot more resources and assigning more roles to the party's distinctive, purely party organizations and external affairs, including the propaganda department, which now has a mission of telling China's story abroad, the international liaison department, which works with foreign political parties and promotes China's image abroad, and the United Front Work Department, a long-standing entity within the party, which has a broad portfolio that includes non-Chinese communist parties and non-communist parties within China, PRC students and non-PRC Chinese ethnic nationals abroad, as well as Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and now the Belt and Road countries. So a serious effort on that front, but Gil cautions, as many of our authors do, that there are potential downsides to the Xi-era agenda, ways in which it may not work or may backfire. For example, the attempt to mute foreign criticisms of the party and China, the long-standing but recently increased identification of the party's interests with the national interest, the strongly nationalist rhetoric, and a kind of zero-sum view of international relations all may help preserve the party's legitimacy and influence at home, but it has a significant risk of damaging China's image and the party's image abroad and its relations with much of the rest of the world, and we've certainly seen some signs of that. So I think just to pull this all together, there are themes that run through the book that basically say the party does take a leading role across virtually every area you can think of within Chinese politics, society, economics, and governance, that in some ways that role has been on the upswing again in terms of the granularity and extent of party influence and control during the Xi Jinping era, and that within the party a fair amount of power and control has moved into Xi's hands, and I think that's one of the takeaways from the 20th Party Congress itself. So that's just a quick overview of what's a fairly thick doorstop of a book, relatively reasonably priced for its bulk. But we welcome your questions. There are a couple in the Q&A already, but please do add your comments to the list. So there's one question from our colleague here at FPRI, Ryan Newhart, who says that Guobin briefly mentioned the internet censorship and the party crackdown on tech companies. How has internet censorship changed under Xi? How complete is party control of information that is shared within China? What's the division of labor between government censors, provincial and local, the national level and more local level, private tech platforms, and anyone else in this space? So let me just start with those, and I'll maybe piggyback some others. Guobin, do you want to address those issues?
Sure. So this is then my personal view. So the major changes under Xi Jinping when it comes to internet censorship and governance is consistent with the return of ideology, which is to say that the old tools of censorship, such as using software, filtering software, deleting, blocking websites, they're still there. But as we all know, this has been done for a long time, but it has not been very effective in reducing citizens' enthusiasm in online expression, right? So the main change is introducing sort of ideological, a new kind of discourse about online expression. And what is that about? It is an emphasis on civility and an emphasis on positive energy. And we see this a lot of this discourse during the lockdown period, especially the Wuhan lockdown. The emphasis on positive energy and civility. What this means is that citizens, of course you can talk, everybody can communicate online, be positive, right? Be civil, and that of course is another way of saying that don't be too critical, and this has been conducted almost in the style of a campaign. There is mobilization. There are all kinds of activities at the local level about, let's say, selection of model civil websites, right? This is kind of old style propaganda. Model civil websites, and why would a website want to be selected? Many websites want to, because if you are selected as a civil website, you actually get more resources. But in order to meet the requirements, then you have to make sure that there is no critical, right, subversive remarks in your forums and so on and so forth. This is the kind of mass mobilization. So in addition to the old forms of censorship, this new form has been, I think, having a strong dampening effect on especially radical forms of protest. So I think this is the major change in the recent, and it happened over a period of 10 years. Now, still, even though there are these changes, even though there's repression, there is all these other forms of control, and this is a quick response to the next question: how complete is party control of what information is shared within China? It's never complete, and this is I agree with Maria Repnikova's argument about Chinese media in general. Her analysis focused on mass media, mainstream media mainly. But even in the mainstream media, where control traditionally has always been very tight, tighter than internet space, there is still space there for citizen expression, for media, commercial media. She talked about, for instance, at the beginning of the Wuhan lockdown, commercial media did a wonderful job of doing investigative reporting. And that's the kind of space that's still possible under certain circumstances. In online spaces, we see, again, during that same period, explosion of citizen expression. And in a more recent period, earlier this year during the Shanghai lockdown, right? We still remember the Shanghai lockdown. There was also an explosion of citizen protest, citizens' voices. So I think there is still this kind of control of information in cyberspace, even under such very powerful kind of conditions of control, still citizens are able to express themselves. And there are, of course, how do they do that? That there's a lot of things we can talk about. They have all kinds of creative strategies, ways of creating memes, screenshots as a way of evading censorship and so on. So there's a lot of stories we can talk about. But in general, I think we still see possibility of online expression from citizens. So Jacques, I'll stop.
Yeah, and that was a terrific reminder of just how complex the landscape is out there in cyberspace. There's one other question in the chat that's a bit of a follow-up on that, so let me throw it in now, which is, you talked about how we shouldn't think of it simply in terms of kind of heavy-handed party-state censorship, although that's certainly part of the mix. Some of this is a positive energy story. But of course, the landscape of the social media and internet space in China has private tech companies, or at least nominally private tech companies. Where are they in this landscape of providing space, yet also being, to some extent, adjuncts of the agents of control? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. All these tech companies, like all other really economic actors, they exist in a very complex ecology. So on the one hand, the censorship of contents that is delegated to these companies, let's say Weibo or WeChat, right? They directly do the business of censorship. But most importantly, we should remember they're first and foremost, businesses, profit-making companies. So they have to be very savvy in managing censorship. In general, and again, this has been like this for a long time from the very beginning of internet development in China. Internet platforms, internet firms have to manage in a very smart way the kind of expressions on their platforms. They don't want to completely wipe out expression, otherwise there is no more business for them. So which means a subtle understanding of the kind of propaganda department's requirements for them, but then very sophisticated ways of managing user expressions on their platforms. And we see this again in all kinds of forms. Sometimes this is the kind of strategy that regular users have learned. Sometimes if you post something, it disappears very quickly, but sometimes it does not disappear that quickly. You know, you have just a few minutes of space, and then these few minutes are critical for the information to spread already, and then they will, they will disappear. There's always the understanding, I think, in general, that some contentious postings on critical issues really bring a lot of traffic, and they don't want to completely wipe out the traffic. Again, have to manage this in very subtle ways. But we all know also that under the Xi Jinping administration, the governance of cyberspace has been centralized, as in many other areas. So it's on the one hand, centralization of this governance structure, but on the other hand, the tech companies squeezed in between citizens and the party. Communication scholars have long argued that media squeezed between the market and the party have to manage to survive in some way. And they continue to do so. They have to do so. Now they, of course, also have to try to attract and retain regular users as their audience, because nowadays social media really depends on the size of their users.
Okay, great, thanks. We've got a mix of questions in the chat, so I'm going to take some from a slightly different category, and then we'll loop back, so these won't necessarily be in the order they're appearing. So there's one question that's much more on the foreign policy security side, which is many resources have been invested in China's Navy and Air Force. Have the ground troops gotten their share? Well, it sort of depends on what you think their share is. It is certainly true that much of the very large budget that has gone into military modernization in China in the last 15, 20 years, which prefaces by saying is that if you look at China's defense spending, some of it is driven by lessons learned from shocking events. So one of the big events driving the recent wave of military modernization in China was the third cross-straits crisis in 95, 96, when China learned, much to its chagrin, that the U.S. felt sufficiently more powerful than China to send the U.S. 7th Fleet quite near the strait, and essentially there was very little China could do about it. The U.S. could just intervene without fear of cost to push back against the pressure that China was exerting against Taiwan at the time. That drove a certain approach to military modernization, which was focused on the possibility of a conflict with the United States over Taiwan and the possibility of taking military action against Taiwan. That sort of scenario obviously tends to put a fair amount of emphasis on the Air Force and the Navy as a way of possibly imposing a blockade, as a way of winning the early phases of a war, way of intimidating Taiwan. Obviously there's a ground forces component, but it's kind of a maritime lift, and the lift capacity for a real invasion is tough to pull off. So it shifted priorities in that direction, and a lot to missiles. A lot have gone into to intermediate range missiles and some into beefing up the strategic nuclear force, so a much more US focused set of scenarios. That does tend to leave the ground troops a little bit farther back in the queue relatively, but I wouldn't overstate that as much as well. So one of the things back on the naval side is that the other contingency that's loomed relatively large recently are the territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas, the disputes with Japan in the East China Sea over the Senkaku, Diaoyutai, Islands, and the South China Sea over the many landforms down there, including the arbitration with the Philippines a few years ago. So all of that tends to pull in a Navy and to a degree Air Force direction. Ground troops still matter. The border clash with India is a contingency that clearly puts a premium on the ground forces. In some ways, one of the shifts away from the traditionally heavily Army-centric approach has been a redefinition of domestic roles. So the domestic security function has been shifted away from the People's Liberation Army's army forces proper to the People's Armed Police, to militia groups, to things like that. Different forces that are focused on domestic security that get the core military out of the domestic security business, which is thought to be a much better thing for an effective fighting force, and so on. Guobin, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that topic at all.
No.
Okay. So another question that's back more on the society side is one which I don't know a whole lot about. Maybe you've been following it closer than I have. But Guobin Yang, a reporter from VOA, asks about the reemergence of state-run canteens and supply and marketing cooperatives in China, measures which remind some people of the initiatives from the Great Leap Forward, obviously a bad period in Chinese and Chinese Communist Party history. Those communal dining ideas didn't last long. They were eliminated in 1962, of course, amid the famine that followed the Great Leap. But academics believe that actually those collective dining experiences and so on played a major role in causing the famine. Is this a significant phenomenon now? Does it echo in a way that we should be concerned about what we saw back in the bad old days, the Great Leap Forward?
No, I think it's not a notable trend. Isolated cases, isolated things, anything nowadays can happen in China. So I don't see this as a trend, and I don't see China is heading back that way yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would think that as the question suggests, and as we have talked about in trying to summarize the book here, Xi Jinping era, the Xi Jinping era in many ways is a turn away from a degree of political liberalism, a commitment to economic markets, and all that sort of thing, to turn away from the trends that had gone farther in those directions during the early decades of the reform era, but that doesn't necessarily mean back to Mao. And I would expect, and Guobin, you may know more about this than I do, that some of what we're seeing with these kinds of communal kitchen welfare type efforts are really much more bound up with Xi's common prosperity, with a kind of concern about the less well off, what Li Chang in his chapter in our book refers to as the populist strand in Xi Jinping politics, which turns a little bit away from what we would associate with the real heady days of maximum reform under Jiang Zemin and people like that. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I totally agree, Jacques. I think, there's another question about the party congress, takeaways from the party congress, and there's a message there which is relevant. I think there is still a great deal of emphasis on economic development. It's not saying something like politics command everything as in the Mao period, right? Economic development, common prosperity is still a dominant theme, even though ideology has become much more important than in the previous administration under Hu and Wen.
So we got another question about whether the mounting friction between the U.S. and China, whether we should think of that in terms of power competition or ideological competition. I'll take a first crack at that, perhaps. And then
that's yours, Jacques.
That's the ideological side may be yours. I don't think it's all either. so there's obviously a lot of discussion these days about whether the U.S.-China relationship needs to be as bad as it is. And for those who are very much part of the kind of distribution of power, structural realists, they call it in the biz, some degree of friction was going to be inevitable, right? That is, the U.S. is losing power relative to China. China is gaining power, and these moments of power transition in the international system tend to be periods of friction, disruption, conflict. Sometimes it goes well, the baton being passed from the United Kingdom to the United States. Other times, most times, it seems not to go quite so well. And we may be seeing a more normal event. And for all the obvious reasons, the previously dominant power has an interest in not seeing the new power rise all too quickly, and so some of these frictions are inevitable. And they tend to be greater when the fault lines are highly valuable places like East Asia, where an expansion of Chinese influence has an impact on American interests in a much more direct way than in a part of the world where there's less economic and technological dynamism and less obvious security issues at stake, perhaps. But it's worse than it needs to be, perhaps. I would say it is worse than it needs to be because of the ideological overlay. These kinds of frictions tend to be worse when you have systems with radically different ways of looking at the world. That's all the new Cold War analogies you see in the U.S.-China relationship. And at a more fine-grained level than that even, I think individual leaders still do matter to some degree. We're probably worse off than we would be if Donald Trump had not recently been president of the United States and if Xi Jinping were not a leader in China, although one does need to note that the Biden administration, its policy toward China is pretty strikingly similar in its fundamentals, although less volatile in its specifics than we saw under Trump. Do you want to speak to any of the ideological component of that, Guobin, or not?
I think, nothing to add really, Jacques.
Okay. All right, so there's another question in the chat, which is the Chinese Communist Party as unified as it presents itself, or are there internal rifts that either exist or that could be used perhaps to influence China in a way that would reduce some of the external frictions we've been talking about? Any thoughts on that?
Not really. I think they again related. This is what China watchers have been talking a lot about before the Party Congress and after the Party Congress, speculating about potential possible personnel appointment and so on and so forth. Of course, we see some drama, as you mentioned at the beginning, Jacques, about Hu Jintao at the Party Congress, seems to sort of suggest some rift there, but at least in appearance, certainly was the appearance of unity presented to the public. But whether there were internal struggles, what kind of struggles were there? I really, really hesitate to speculate on that front.
Yeah, we don't get invited into the inner circles of Zhongnanhai High to talk about who's stabbing whom in the back. But I think some of the chapters in the book get into, particularly one by Cheng Li on elite politics. It really has been remarkable the degree to which Xi Jinping seems to have squeezed out those who are associated with sort of different factions, is I think probably an overly dramatic word, but certainly different career paths and personal ties, and with different political or ideological positions. This really is all of Xi Jinping's people on the Politburo Standing Committee, and even somewhat beyond that in a way that I think went beyond even what people would have expected. But Guobin, you follow the Chinese social media, Chinese popular attitudes in a variety of ways. What's your sense of the degree to which there's... So one characterization of this is, it's not so much that Xi Jinping and his particular view of the Chinese Communist Party, his role, has somehow triumphed and everybody's on board with it, but rather that he's been pretty successful at reducing potential opposition to essentially diffuse grumbling. A lot of people are unhappy, a lot of people have complaints, but there's just no real way to organize it into a way that threatens either within the party or outside the party the grip of Xi. To put it colloquially, you can't beat something with nothing, and he's made it very hard for anybody else to have something, to have organized politics, sort of monopolizing that space. Do you see that?
Now, not surprisingly, you don't see a lot of talk about the Congress at all on Chinese social media, in contrast to what we see here on social media, on Twitter, for instance. But there's one interesting episode, interesting story. I think a lot of people were intrigued. A lot of people were surprised by the appointment of new propaganda chief, Li Shulei. And because Li Shulei, his career, he came out of academia, was a scholar of Chinese literature, published many books. And in many of his publications, he, of course, he showed deep understanding of Chinese tradition culture, but also relatively liberal views. So there is quite a bit of talk about this person, and people, there seems to be a rush to try to get hold of his writings, and his writings then quickly were disappearing from social media. Used to be some collections, essays, and so on, and no longer easy to find. So I think there is a lot of interest in that person, and that person is interesting in I think in relation to another question you just mentioned, the question of loyalty to Xi as opposed to qualifications, meritocracy, right? Because I think people suspect that he was appointed because he was a close follower of Xi, worked closely with Xi when Xi was the head of the party school. But at the same time, it's hard to say that he's not qualified as a propaganda chief, because he's been sort of in this field for a long time. So that's the little bit of social media discourse I've seen, but not in general, not much discussion at all. Probably not possible to discuss these high-level appointments, as we know that mention of names of Xi Jinping, you can't really post this kind of messages on social media. It will be blocked.
And the propaganda chief is an interesting move, because it is somebody with some intellectual chops and departs a bit from the sort of cronyism that a lot have seen in the elite level appointments. We're almost up against our time here, and so I guess to wrap it up, there are a few questions that I think could be grouped under the what are the lessons of the 20th Party Congress? What are the big takeaways? You averted to that briefly, and somebody asked that explicitly, but I think a lot of the rest of them cluster around what should we expect going forward in light of what we learned in the last couple of weeks. My take on the 20th Party Congress is it's kind of like what we expected, only more so. It was going to be consolidation in Xi's hands. It went a little farther than we thought. There was going to be an emphasis on security relative to economics, not an exclusion of economics, but the sort of sense that zero COVID is with us for a while, that there's a more securitized notion of economic policy, concerns about the U.S. trying to keep China down, reducing vulnerabilities to things like the chip embargoes and so on, and a more statist conception of the economy, a role of the state in leading technological development, creating technological self-sufficiency, and so on, and a much more pessimistic view of China's external relations, mixed with an optimistic one. So the optimistic one is there's a China model from which the rest of humanity can learn. That's been building for a while. The pessimistic one is the era of strategic opportunity may be winding down a little bit, or at least it is now conjoined with a bunch of meteorological metaphors, storms, winds, and in all but name the U.S. trying to keep China down. And I think a turning toward an even somewhat harsher at the margins stance on Taiwan issues. So those are my takeaways. Guobin, you get the last comment in terms of your takeaways.
No, I don't think I have anything to add. You put it very well, John.
Okay, well, gee, I'm happy to end on that note. So thank you all for joining us. Please do consider buying the book. I think it's a nice collection in there, and I thank Guobin for joining me today as we've tried to cover a lot of ground. Thank you all for joining us. Please join us for future FPRI events. We'll have a bunch more Zoom sessions like this. We will be getting back to doing some on-site things probably in the beginning of the calendar year. But again, thanks to Guobin Yang, my colleague at Penn and on the Zoomcast and co-editor of the book, The Party Leads All. And thank you all for joining us. See you all soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.